I'm going to talk about the hormonal regulation in ovarian cycle. The ovarian cycle is regulated by 5 different hormones. The first hormone is known as gonadotropin releasing hormone, or in short is GnRH, follicle stimulating hormone FSH, luteinizing hormone LH, estrogen, and lastly is progesterone. So at puberty, hypothalamus starts to secrete hormones, namely GnRH. The GnRH will affect the anterior pituitary gland to start secreting FSH and LH. In women, both FSH and LH will affect what happens within the ovary. During this time, FSH plays more important role than LH to stimulate the development of the follicle within the ovary. So the FSH will stimulate the growing of follicles. So what will happen when the FSH level is high? It causes several primary follicles to develop inside the ovary. So this is known as follicular phase during ovarian cycle. So when the follicles develop, it starts to secrete the estrogen. So at the earlier part of development, only small amount of estrogen is being released. So at low concentration of estrogen will exert a negative feedback on anterior pituitary gland. So the anterior pituitary gland is inhibited from secreting more FSH and LH. So these hormone levels is being kept low. When the follicles continue to develop, so more estrogen is being secreted, which causes the concentration of estrogen to be increasing. When the concentration of estrogen is increasing, it causes a different effect on anterior pituitary gland, which causes it to stimulate the anterior pituitary gland to secrete more FSH and LH by positive feedback. During this time, LH plays more important role than FSH for final maturations of the Graafian follicle. So a high level of luteinizing hormone will cause 2 events to occur. Firstly, it will stimulate the process of ovulation, which causes the secondary oocyte inside the ovary will be released. So if you notice at the first part, when the concentration of estrogen is low, it will cause the negative feedback on anterior pituitary gland. So it causes less FSH and LH to be released. This is because the follicles is not fully matured. So there's not much LH is produced to prevent early ovulation. So when the estrogen is in high concentration, it will stimulate anterior pituitary gland by positive feedback to secrete more FSH and LH. So high level of LH will start to stimulate the ovulation process. This is proper because during this time, the follicles has already matured into Graafian follicles. And LH also stimulate the transformation of the ruptured follicle into corpus luteum. So the presence of corpus luteum will cause the secretion of 2 hormones, progesterone and estrogen. So that means before the ovulation process, the developing follicle is secreting the estrogen. But after the ovulation process, the corpus luteum is secreting the estrogen plus another hormone, namely progesterone. So high level of progesterone and estrogen exerts a negative feedback on anterior pituitary gland, causing them to secrete less FSH and LH. So that means after the formation of corpus luteum, the level of FSH and LH will reduce to prevent another follicles from being developed. So now you can see this graph showing the relative levels of 4 different hormones. So you can see that inside the follicular phase, when the primary follicles is developing, so it secretes the estrogen. So when the early development of the follicles, so small amount of estrogen is secreted. When small amount of estrogen is being secreted, it exerts the negative feedback on anterior pituitary gland, which cause the level of LH and FSH to decrease at this point. So when the follicles keep on growing, it causes the follicles to develop into Graafian follicles and more estrogen is released. In high level of estrogen, it exerts a positive feedback on anterior pituitary gland, which causes the level of LH and FSH to rise steeply. So just before the ovulation, the level of LH reach maximum. This will stimulate two events. The first is ovulation process. So the secondary oocyte is released during the ovulation phase. And the increasing level of LH will also stimulate the ruptured follicles to transform itself into corpus luteum. And this corpus luteum will secrete the estrogen and progesterone. So you can see the significant increase of estrogen and progesterone after ovulation process. But before ovulation, the level of progesterone is very low, since the developing follicles only secrete estrogen but not progesterone.
When the level of estrogen and progesterone is high, it exerts negative feedback on anterior pituitary gland, and you can see that the level of LH and FSH drops during that time. This is very important, especially for FSH to be kept at low concentration at this time, because we want to inhibit other primary follicles from developing. Because the secondary oocyte has just been released and we are not sure yet whether fertilization occurs. If fertilization occurs, then there's no need for the primary follicles to be developing. This is to maximize the usage of the secondary oocyte for fertilization.
But if fertilization does not occur around day 23 to day 25, so the corpus luteum will degenerate, which causes the level of progesterone and estrogen drops. So when the level of estrogen and progesterone drops, it causes the negative feedback to be removed, which causes anterior pituitary gland to secrete more FSH and LH. So this is by negative feedback.
When FSH level rise, so it causes another primary follicles to start developing.
So you can see the relation of the 4 relative hormones during the regulations of the ovarian cycle.